Okay, hi everybody, good evening, and I hope Shavuos was nice. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about something connected to Shavuos, and that's Megillat Ruth. So there's something I wanted to share with you. And Megillat Ruth is one of the, what we might call one of the jewels of Tanakh. It's a very short book, a very beautiful book, a very poetic book, both a romantic book, a spiritual book, and there are two different questions that people often confuse as being the same thing. Number one, why was Megillat Ruth written? Number two, why do we read it on Shavuos? Those are absolutely two different questions. The reason why the book was written has nothing to do with Shavuos. Megillat Ruth originally was not written to be read on Shavuos. So first, the reason why the book was written, according to Chazal, the author of Megillat Ruth is none other than the Navi Shmuel. Shmuel HaNavi wrote Megillat Ruth. And he had primarily one basic reason for writing Megillat Ruth shortly before he died. He wanted to establish the legitimacy of the lineage of David HaMelech. Because after all, he is the one that anointed David HaMelech as king shortly before his death, and he wanted to be sure that David HaMelech's lineage would be accepted. What's the problem? The problem is that the Torah contains a prohibition in Parshas Guise, Lo Yavo Amoni Umoavi B'Kal Hashem. A Moabite or an Ammonite. Now these are the nations that were descended from Lot's incest with his two daughters. After Sodom was destroyed, Lot was with daughter number one, and she named her son Moab from my father. And Lot was then, the next night he got drunk and he was with daughter number two, and she named her daughter Ammon from the nation, my nation, named the son rather, from a nation. And Ammon and Moab are therefore descended from Lot's daughters. They were conceived literally in incest. And the Torah says, even if they convert to Judaism, and they are Jews, the Jewish people are not allowed to marry with them. Lo Yavo Amoni Moavi B'Kal Hashem. Now, interestingly enough, the reason the Torah gives is not because of the incest. That is not the reason. But the reason is because of the selfishness and lack of compassion. Al Devar Asher Lo Kidmu Etchem Belechem Uvamayim, that when we were on the verge of entering the land of Israel, we wanted to pass through the Moabite and the Ammonite territory, and they refused to give us food and water, even if we were willing to pay for it. And it was that selfishness, that cruelty, that lack of compassion that invalidated the Ammonites and the Moabites from entering the congregation of God, even if they convert. Now, the halacha happens to be, for reasons we'll discuss, that only applies to male Moabites and Ammonites. It does not apply to females. So Ruth herself is a convert from the nation of Moab. As a result, she was permitted to marry Boaz, and her descendants would therefore not suffer the taint of being descended from a Moabite. However, this halacha was not well known, and consequently, Shmuel saw with Ruach HaKodesh that there would be constant aspersions and attacks on King David's lineage coming from the tainted Moabite woman. So Shmuel wanted to write a story showing that Boaz, who was known as the Gadol Hador, again, we don't know that from elsewhere, but it was understood by that contemporary generation that Boaz was like Rav Yosef, Rabbi Yosef, a great Talmid Chacham. And Boaz married Ruth in a public ceremony. Ergo, the halacha must be that female Moabites are permitted. Therefore, David HaMelech is not tainted. A very, very simple, basic reason. Shmuel HaNavi wanted to establish the public record that Boaz, the Gadol Hador, married Ruth. Therefore, it must be that the prohibition of the Moabite only applies to the male. It does not apply to the female. That is the basic reason why he wrote the story of Ruth, to legitimate the lineage of David HaMelech. That also explains why there's a curious omission in the story that Chazal tell us existed, and there's no remez. And that is the following. According to Chazal, Boaz consummated his marriage with Ruth, and he died the next morning. He died the next morning. Now, Shmuel does not give us that detail in Megillat Ruth, and the reason is quite obvious. What will people think? Here we have a person who marries a Moabite woman. So initially people say, well, if Boaz did it, it must be okay. He's then struck by lightning the next day. What are people going to say? I guess he didn't do the right thing. Now, in reality, it was really the opposite. Boaz was very old. He had lost a wife. He had lost a phenomenal number of children. According to Chazal, he had 120 children, 60 sons and 60 daughters. They all died. He was alone. He was bereft. He was old. He was sick. He didn't want to get married at all. God kept him alive artificially so he could consummate his marriage with Ruth. He didn't die as a punishment. He was kept alive supernaturally so he would do what needed to be done. Nevertheless, this type of detail would be prone to such misunderstanding that Shmuel Hanavi felt it would be better to leave it. So, be it as it may, the basic story of Ruth is the story of how this woman converted to Judaism, and she embraced the Torah with love and with devotion and with commitment, and it shows her kindness and compassion to her mother-in-law, and how Boaz, who is of the lineage descended from Yehuda, consummated his marriage with Ruth, and from that union came David HaMelech, and eventually Moshiach. Right? So Moshiach comes precisely from Ruth the Moabite. In fact, not only that, but it's interesting that as hateful and hated as is the nation of Ammon and Moab, Moshiach comes from a combination of Ammon and Moab. The Rambam writes that Moshiach is descended not only from David HaMelech, but Moshiach is descended from Shlomo HaMelech. David had many sons. Shlomo is the one from whom Moshiach comes, and Shlomo had many wives, but one of his wives is Naamah ha'Ammonis. Naamah the Ammonite. So, Moshiach is descended from Ruth the Moabite, who married Boaz, and they had a son Oved, and Oved had a son Yishai, and Yishai had a son David. And then Shlomo, of his 1,000 wives, one of them was Naamah ha'Ammonis, and that is the Messianic line. So it's a very fascinating thing that Ammon and Moab are in fact, both of them are the ancestors of Moshiach ben David. Now, one interesting point that I want to discuss, though, is the following. Naomi goes to Moab with her husband and her two sons. Her two sons marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. Naomi loses her sons, loses her husband, comes back to Eretz Yisrael. Her two daughters-in-law originally go with her. Orpah turns back. Ruth remains. And Ruth eventually marries Boaz. But the way Ruth marries Boaz, it's almost like a seduction. Naomi tells Ruth, go to Boaz in the middle of the night when he's asleep. He's sleeping in the threshing floor. And lie down next to him and uncover his feet. Now granted, it was not a true seduction because they did not have intercourse that night till after they were married. But it's something certainly a typical Beis Yaakov girl certainly would not do. She comes to a man in the middle of the night, lies down next to him and says, marry me. Boaz is kind of shocked and confused. What is going on? Is that the way for a tsanua to behave? So there's a very deep meaning here. Lefi Pshat, Naomi understands how critical this marriage is. Naomi understands with Ruach HaKodesh that Boaz is towards the very end of his life. Im lo achshav, eimatai. Naomi understands that this is the relationship that's going to produce David HaMelech and produce Moshiach. Naomi understands that Boaz is not taking any initiative. Boaz is not making any overtures. So one could simply learn she wants to shock Boaz into recognizing what his obligations are. Look at what I made Rus do, so you'll realize how important this is. And the very fact that her behavior is shocking operates as something that will shock Boaz into recognizing that he does have to act. There's a closer relative, but assuming that other relative gets out of the way, Boaz is going to be ready to step in. Had Naomi not done it in that shocking way, Boaz never would have even thought that such a union was possible. He was old, she was young. Boaz, Misvara, logically, did not think this was a shidduch that was matim. Yeah?
How old was Ruth?
How old was Ruth? We don't have an exact age, but there was probably around a 40-year difference between them. Boaz was much, much older than Ruth. Indeed, you'll recall that Boaz remarks to Ruth, God will reward you for not seeking younger people and going to me. Ruth was obviously still relatively young. She was able to go into the fields and gather and bring back grain to her mother-in-law and the like. So this is why Naomi did what she did. But the Zohar offers a very, very deep explanation that has very interesting and difficult repercussions for modern life. The Zohar, and again, the Zohar itself is difficult to understand. It's based on Rav Kook and Rav Tzadok's interpretation of the Zohar. We know that in the world there are forces that are forces of negativity and evil. Now, unlike Christianity, that actually looks at evil as some type of demonic force that is fighting God, like the Antichrist or the like, we actually believe that evil itself is either created or at least enabled by God in order to create free will, in order to create struggle, because there is a concept that goodness is only goodness when it's chosen, and in order to be chosen virtue, there has to be the capacity to make negative choices. So evil, you might say, is a necessary evil. And evil ultimately gets its energy from God. And although God does not want us to go down that path, but he enables us to go down that path because that facilitates the higher values of bechira, of free will, moral choice. Because once again, if there wouldn't be the capacity to choose evil, our choosing of good would not be virtuous. It would just be mechanical. There is no virtue in choosing good unless you had the opportunity to choose bad, and unless the bad paid off in some way, right? Imagine you had a world where every time you choose evil, you got an electric shock, and it goes up 5 volts every repeat offense. Well, okay, at some point you would choose only good, but you would be no better than a pigeon in a Skinner's box. Even a dumb pigeon. Pigeons are not smart. Crows are smart, but pigeons are not particularly bright. But even a pigeon knows if one lever gives it a shock and the other lever gives it a piece of corn, it's going to choose the piece of corn. You understand, if God set up a system where good guys always win in the short term and bad guys always lose, then the good guys would be good not because they've chosen goodness. The good guys would be good because they've chosen expediency. This is actually a very important idea. In some sense, you almost have to have a world where evil has short-term triumphs, because that's the only way morality is truly chosen, as opposed to simply doing what's ever most convenient. So that's what I say, evil is a necessary evil. So there are evil forces in the world. And these evil forces, whether in the guise of people, movements, in Kabbalah it posits demons, however you want to visualize it, they often prevent holiness from coming into the world. Right? Kabbalah uses the phrase, sitra achra, the other side. So as a result, the Zohar posits, sometimes great and powerful goodness can enter the world only if it goes under the radar, only if it comes in the guise of something that's not so good. You know, we have in English an expression, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Well, here we can invert the expression. you sometimes have to have a sheep in wolf's clothing. Imagine in a graphic way, visual way. You have these guards, and their job is to prevent good from entering the world. So the guards have to be fooled. The good has to dress up like bad. And when it dresses up like bad, the guards let it in, even though it's actually good. So the Zohar says, quite an amazing idea, that goodness sometimes enters the world through the cover of apparent sin and apparent evil. And you see this totally in the history of the Davidic line, which culminates in ultimately Moshiach, in redeeming the world. Let's go back, right? Rus is the great-grandmother of David HaMelech. Rus comes from Ammon and Moab. Ammon and Moab had their genesis in incest. 2 daughters slept with their father on 2 successive nights. It's quite strange that Moshiach should be descended from relationships that were incestuous. Right? That's one aspect of it. Now let's look at Boaz. Boaz himself is descended from Yehuda and Tamar. Now remember the story of Yehuda and Tamar. Right? Yehuda had a daughter-in-law, Tamar. Tamar was married to one son, Er. Er died. Onan fulfilled a yibum by marrying Tamar. Onan died. Yehuda had a third son, Shelah. Yehuda did not want his daughter-in-law to marry Shelah because she thought she was a dangerous woman, the sons were dying. So she kept her like a widow. So what did Tamar do? She dressed up like a prostitute. And she enticed Yehuda. Yehuda did not know he was with his daughter-in-law. When she conceived the child, Yehuda did not know it was his child. And he sentenced her to death, to be burning, because she effectively committed adultery based on the concept that she was beholden and betrothed to his third son. Although it's an unfair situation because Yehuda was not allowing his third son to marry her, but still she was somehow connected to that third son. And Tamar, you'll recall, was willing to go to her death and be burnt instead of humiliating him. She would not reveal his identity. She simply said, "The man that gave me the staff and the money belt is the man I was with." Yehuda was the only person in the world, besides Tamar, who knew that that was him. And he stepped forward and he admitted, etc. But Tamar was willing to die. What do Chazal say? The famous Chazal. Better to throw yourself into a fiery furnace rather than humiliate somebody publicly. So, nevertheless, from that union, Tamar had twins. One son was called Zerach, and one son was called Peretz. Peretz is the ancestor of Boaz, therefore the ancestor of David, the ancestor of Moshiach. So look at what's going on here. On one hand, Mitzad Rus, you have the incest of Ammon and Moab. Mitzad Boaz, you have the prostitution, so to speak, of Yehuda and Tamar.
Is that adultery?
Huh?
Was it called adultery? She was,
Well, again, the halachic status is very complicated. It's before Matan Torah, so the normal halachas don't apply here. But it was at least quasi-adultery, because it was understood that she was beholden to Shelah. Now, the truth of the matter is, Yehuda's behavior is very, very unfair. On one hand, he's condemning her for adultery because she was beholden to Shelah, the third son. On the other hand, Yehuda is not letting her marry the third son. So Yehuda's kind of using inconsistent positions here. You can't marry my third son, but you are married to him, and therefore you're guilty of adultery, and that's why he was going to sentence her to death. Boaz and Rus itself has the appearance of impropriety, where she comes in the middle of the night and she lies down next to him. And of course, the fact that Rus herself is a Moabite, even though the halacha is female Moabites are permitted, you see from many Gemaras and Midrashim, this halacha was forgotten again and again and again and again, and people constantly raised accusations that David HaMelech is tainted because he comes from the accursed Moabite people, even though halachically it was not a problem. So what you see over here is that everything about the generation of David HaMelech, yes, I'll get to that. Everything about the generation of David HaMelech is shrouded in sin, in taint, in impropriety. Let's even go further. There's even more than that. That's what Rabbi Poston was alluding to. It is said, if you remember, when Shmuel is commanded to go to Yishai and anoint one of his sons as king, he goes to Yishai and says, bring me your sons, and Hashem will tell me which one of them is king. And 7 sons are brought, and they're handsome and tall and righteous and very capable. But Shmuel sees that none of them are the one that Hashem chose. He then asks Yishai, do you have any other children? Do you have any other sons? And Yishai says, yeah, there's a guy that's taking care of the sheep, but you're not interested in him. Shmuel says, bring him to me. And that, of course, is David. Now the question is, why didn't Yishai bring David in the first place? Shmuel the Navi said, Hashem has commanded me to tell you, bring me all your sons. So Yishai just decides not to bring one of them? Yishai is known as a great tzaddik. The Gemara in fact says, Yishai committed no averis at all. So how could he disobey the commandment of the Navi? So the Medrash says a very, very amazing thought. The Medrash says, Yishai did not know that David was his son until that very moment. David is around 28 years old at that time. Certainly very close to 30. And the Medrash explains, this is a very wild story, that as Yishai was getting older, Yishai himself began to question whether he had a heter to live with his Jewish wife, because he's descended from Rus the Moabite, and perhaps female Moabites are prohibited, and therefore he's tainted. So what Yishai did was, Yishai separated from his wife, and he took a non-Jewish maidservant to cohabit with, thinking that because he's tainted and cannot marry regular Jews, he could live with a shifcha kananis, a non-Jewish maidservant. His wife disguised herself as the maidservant, and she actually was with Yishai when he thought he was with the maidservant. When he saw, again, it's really almost a replication of Yehuda and Tamar. When he sees that his wife is pregnant, he thinks his wife committed adultery, and David HaMelech is a mamzer, a child born of adultery. So Yishai, when he was told to bring his sons to Shmuel, didn't bring David. He didn't think David was his son. David was a mamzer. Now, David's mother told him the true story, but for whatever reason, this was kept secret for many, many years. And when David HaMelech in Tehillim describes very often how he was humiliated, how he was made fun of, how he was rejected, the Medrash connects it. For almost 30 years, he was treated as an outcast. He was treated as an illegitimate child. He was not treated as a son of Yishai. He was treated as an object of shame and derision. And that is the meaning of the pasuk in Hallel, Even Masu Habonim, the stone that the builders rejected. Haisa l'rosh pinah has become the main cornerstone, and Bonim could also be read Banim, the stone that the sons, the other sons, had rejected. Haisa l'rosh pinah. So once again, David HaMelech is characterized as a mamzer, a product of adultery. And then finally, let me point out that in the next generation, Shlomo HaMelech is born from Bathsheba. And let's consider the relationship of David and Bathsheba. Now it's true that the Gemara says David technically didn't do anything wrong. Uriah Hachiti had given Bathsheba a get, and she was technically divorced because soldiers used to give their wives gittin before they went to war. But spiritually, the relationship with Bathsheba, spiritually, was adulterous, because it was understood she would go back to the husband. And from that relationship came Shlomo HaMelech, who himself is the ancestor of Moshiach, via his marriage to Nama, the Ammonite, coming back to incest all the way back. So you really have kind of almost a soap opera of all sorts of sins. The incest of Ammon and Moab, the apparent prostitution of Yehuda and Tamar, the seducement of Boaz by Ruth, coming to the Goren, coming to the threshing floor in the middle of the night, the accusation that David HaMelech may be a mamzer from his mother committing adultery, although that was not true, in her marriage to Yishai. David committing apparent adultery with Bathsheba. And Shlomo then marrying an Ammonite woman who herself was a product of incest, going all the way back. The Zohar makes the point that the soul of Moshiach is such a tremendous holiness that will change the world, that will redeem the world, that will elevate the world. But the greater the holiness, the greater are the forces of evil arrayed to stop that holiness from coming into the world. So the only way that holiness can come into the world is if it comes in the guise of impropriety, of avera, of things that don't look quite right, because that relaxes the vigilance of the powers of evil that let this come in. Now, the implications of this are quite interesting, controversial, difficult. Both Rav Kook and Rav Tzadok, in different ways, point out that this is a key to understanding certain developments in modernity that on one level are very much against Torah, but contain sparks of holiness which need to be extracted. Rav Kook in particular actually mentioned feminism. Obviously he was writing in the early part of the 20th century, in which there was a movement in the world for women to have certain equalities in rights. Rav Kook said the concept of the dignity of women, that they should not be oppressed, they shouldn't be abused, they should be treated, let's say in the workforce, with equality, that was actually a good and noble end. That would be something that would replace the misogynistic tendencies, not so much of the Jewish world, but of the world generally. And that was a legitimate and proper idea. But it came into the world masked with all sorts of perversions. Consider today, when you have various feminist arguments, let's have women rabbis or women adim, all sorts of, I don't want to get into the specifics, but you often find that Jewish feminism often turns into an attack on halachic structures. And Rav Kook basically says that is the sheep that enters the world in wolf's clothing. And the difficulty is that when good enters the world intermixed with a lot of things that are wrong, it takes a great deal of wisdom and discernment to be able to separate the good from the bad. It's like a beautiful fruit that contains poison. There is a beautiful fruit there, but there's also poison that will kill you unless you figure out how to separate it. Zionism was another example, Rav Kook says. The yearning to come back to Eretz Yisrael, the yearning to rebuild Eretz Yisrael in both a physical and a spiritual way, was a noble and holy feeling that emanated from the deepest recesses of the neshama. But the Sitra Achra would not allow that holiness to enter the world unless it came under the radar through the guise of secular movements that to some degree were even antagonistic to religion and to God. So in the phenomenon of secular Zionism, Rav Kook saw a holy and noble and good idea that was entering the world in perhaps a form that was not appropriate. Others have said this was even true about something like the Reform movement. And again, I'm saying things that are risky, but and that is the following. Rav Kook writes that in many, many communities, Orthodox religion, from life, had become stale. It had become rote. It had become routine. People were going through the motions without feeling, without kavanah, without passion. So various rebellions arose against traditional Judaism, which were spiritually attempts to bring vitality, renewal, new energy. But they got perverted and they got distorted into various rejections. I'll give you maybe a more relevant example than even Reform, and that is so many Jews turn to Buddhism or even Christianity, but Buddhism is even a bigger attraction. 9 out of 10 English-speaking converts to Buddhism are Jews. Now, on one level, you could say that's a great tragedy. Buddhism is technically avodah zarah, etc. God forbid, what type of world is it when our children are seeking idolatrous religions or even Christianity? But there's something very deep here, because often the Jews that are seeking these religious outlets are actually very, very deeply spiritual people. They are turned off by what they perceive as the superficiality of Jewish life, often not in the religious world. They're turned off by the materialism, by the decadence, by the lack of God discourse. So they're seeking a connection with God. They don't know where to go. So they go here and there. They're going totally in the wrong way. But it emanates from a deep spirituality. They're looking for something. They're not content to simply go on the career merry-go-round to get the golden ring. They're looking for something deeper in life. They're looking for something more in life. So on one hand, it's a tragedy that that's where they're going. On the other hand, it's a blessing that they are looking for God. And at some point, we believe if you look for God, even if you're going in the wrong direction, you're going to find Him one way or the other. So the phenomenon we're describing is a very deep and pervasive phenomenon, that there is good that enters the world, but somehow in its transition from the spiritual source to the grungy realities of everyday life, sometimes that good gets contaminated and infiltrated. And that's how it enters the world, indeed. But at that point, it can become poisonous unless you figure out how to separate the good from the evil. Right? The tree of knowledge of good and evil, meaning good and evil, and good and evil is intermixed. That can bring death. Now, last year, there was a very prominent rabbi in London, Rabbi Dweck, who was a Sephardic rabbi in London, and he made a speech about the Jewish approach to homosexuality. And you may have heard about this story. This was a really, really sad story in some ways. And he said things in a way that I personally think should not have been said, but I'll tell you what he said, and I'll tell you that when I heard it, it didn't even bother me because it is well within this type of tradition. He said, again, I do not endorse the way he said it, but he basically said, gay rights, gay marriage, these are good things for Jewish people because they teach us that men should not be ashamed to have love and care and concern for other men. Yes, it's wrong that it turns into marriage and sexual relationships because that's what the Torah prohibits. But the basic idea that I should be able to love a man as well, meaning love in terms of friendship, like David and Yonasan. That's a good thing. And when men have been unable to have those types of friendships, that was a bad thing. And therefore the gay rights brings to the world this idea that men can have emotions, and men can have feelings, and men can have friendships that are very deep. Now, let me tell you that the reaction to his speech was very, very explosive, because basically you have a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi, coming out and saying, gay marriage is a good thing for the Jewish people. Just that line alone. As a result, he was like 1 inch away from just losing his position. And although eventually the London Basin allowed him to keep his position, I believe, this is unbelievable to me, I don't think I would stay as a rabbi if I had this condition, that he has to submit every sermon he's going to give to the approval of the London Basin. And he agreed to it. I don't think I would have agreed to it, but okay. Now, I wouldn't have said what he said. Obviously, the Torah considers homosexual relationships abominations, toevot, and particularly in this age where so many of the boundaries are metushtash, they're all confused, there needs to be clarity that the Torah prohibits things. Okay, and a rabbi has to be extra careful. Pirkei Avos says, Chachamim hizaharu b'divreichem. Be very careful how you talk. So I think Rabbi Dweck made a mistake. But as a matter of fact, what he said happens to be true at the same time. And this is exactly the Zohar's point, that in evil there is a kernel of good, which can then get distorted and abused and exaggerated and misapplied. And we need to be vigilant about that. But that doesn't mean there's not a good that you can't extract. His point is exactly Rav Kook and Rav Tzadok. So when I heard it, it didn't even shock me that much. Because, this is Rav Kook, Rav Tzadok, this is Malchus Beis David. This is how we understand feminism and Zionism, and even the movements that rebelled against traditional Judaism. Coming from a desire for hitchadshut, for renewal. That's why Rav Kook saw in even the rebelliousness against Frumkeit, he saw something positive, people seeking some type of renewal, although they don't understand the right way to do it, and they're not turning to the right sources. Right, so this is a powerful idea, it's a controversial idea, it's a dangerous idea, it's a subversive idea. I understand that. So don't tell my employer, I don't want to get in trouble in my yeshiva. But nevertheless, there is something true about this, fundamentally and deeply true, and this is what the Zohar sees in the notion of the tainted lineage of David HaMelech. But there's another point I want to make as well, maybe a simpler point, and that is the following idea. We know that before Moshiach ben David comes, there is a pre-Moshiach called Moshiach ben Yosef, descended from Yosef. And Moshiach ben Yosef, it is said, is going to be killed in the pre-Messianic wars of Gog and Magog, and will pave the way for Moshiach ben David. In fact, the Arizal writes, when you say in Shmona Esrei, V'chisei David meheira l'sochat tachin, may you speedily establish the throne for David. The throne for David is Mashiach ben Yosef. So you're actually praying for Mashiach ben Yosef. V'chisei David meheira l'sochat tachin is Mashiach ben Yosef. So we know that although Yosef indeed was a king in Mitzrayim, but ultimate redemption comes not from Yosef, but it comes from David and Shevet Yehuda. Why is that so? So the Avnei Nezer says a very, very beautiful thought. He says Yosef and Yehuda, and David as well, represent two different ways of dealing with sin. When Yosef is subject to temptation, Potiphar's wife tries to tempt Yosef. Yosef just says no. No. Yosef represents the power in the world to resist sin, resist evil. And that's very important. We need to know we have the koach to make the right choices in life. Yehuda, on the other hand, represents a different aspect. When Yehuda is tempted by the Tamar, thinking she's a prostitute, Yehuda succumbs to apparent sin. But Yehuda teaches us, when we fail, how we come back to God with tshuva and repentance. Yosef is the leader that teaches us how not to fail. Yehuda is the leader that teaches us, when we fail, how we come back. The pasuk says in Mishlei, in Proverbs, Sheva Yipo Tzadik V'kam. The tzaddik falls 7 times and gets up again. That actually refers to spiritual failures. The tzaddik can also fail. The tzaddik can also sin. But the tzaddik doesn't give up hope. The tzaddik maintains emunah both in God and emunah in himself. And he does not allow himself to be vanquished by the spiritual defeats of life. He goes on. He recreates. He rebuilds. He does not get discouraged. Now, a king, certainly the Messianic king, is supposed to be a role model of inspiration for us. But the role model of the person who never makes a mistake, the role model of the person who is perfect, is not really the role model for us, because we're not perfect. But the person who fails and makes mistakes, but teaches us how to come back, that's the person we learn from. That's the person we grow from. You know, Rav Hutner, back in the 1970s, when Art Scroll started and the whole genre of biographies of great rabbis, biographies of Gedolim, began, so Rav Hutner was initially critical of some of the biographies of Gedolim, because these biographies painted these rabbis as superhuman creatures who did things that were beyond normal comprehension. So a biography might say, when he was 4 years old, he knew the Babylonian Talmud. And at 5, he did a siyum on Yerushalmi. And at his bar mitzvah, he had finished Shulchan Aruch 1,000 times with the Pri Megadim's commentary. And you read about superhuman achievements that are so unbelievable. Now, Rav Hutner was a little critical of that approach, because Rav Hutner basically said, okay, I read about things that I'll never do and my children will never do. So I'm entertained, I'm fascinated, I'm amazed. But how does that bear on how I live my life? But Rav Hutner said, you have to understand that although indeed there were many Gedolim that were blessed with great, great brilliance, but they too had struggles in their lives. They too had issues they were grappling with. And in many, many ways, we would learn much more from understanding their struggles and even their mistakes and their failures than we would from simply describing these unbroken successes. Now, halachically, there is a problem in writing that type of biography. Lashon Hara, there are going to be issues. In fact, it's so fascinating that I'm speaking about this the day after the Patira of a great rabbi who tried to explore these issues in exactly this way. You may have heard that Rav Nosson Kamenetsky, the son of Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, just died. Rav Nosson Kamenetsky was a great Rosh Hashiva in Eretz Yisrael here. Rav Shmuel Kamenetsky's older brother. And Rav Nosson Kamenetsky wrote around, maybe more than 20 years ago, what was supposed to be a biography of his father called The Making of a Gadol. And this book engendered extreme controversy because Rav Nosson decided that he wasn't only going to write about his father, he was going to write about the whole yeshiva world in Eastern Europe and all of the problems that were faced, whether it was secularism, whether it was involvement in communism, whether it was, boys writing to women, etc. And he wrote about struggles Rav Aaron went through and his father went through. And this book was excommunicated. It was put in cherem, because how dare he write anything negative about Gedolim. And he wrote a second edition where he tried to take out some of the more controversial stuff, and that got put in cherem. It's interesting. I remember the book. I don't own the book, but it is available online. But the way it worked was, the book was sold in stores for $25. After the book was banned, Rav Nosson withdrew it from sale. So somebody was selling bootleg copies on eBay for $500. Now you can get it online. It is actually a phenomenal book. Rav Nosson made a cheshbon, and the cheshbon is very, very true. That you need to know the struggles, the nisyonos, the failures of even our greatest, because then we learn how they became great, and then we learn how we can become great. So, that is why the Malchus of Am Yisrael was not given to Yosef, who represents the person who doesn't make a mistake, but to Yehuda and David, who make mistakes, who fail, but then show us how to come back to Hashem with tshuva. And that's yet another aspect in the ins and outs and the questionable lineage of David HaMelech. Now again, this is a controversial idea, the notion that the greatest leader on some level is the leader who struggles with the same types of issues that we struggle. I think all of us know this, even in the context of parenting. Although you have to think about how much do you tell your child. Your child is grappling with a certain issue. It could be anything. It could be drugs, it could be sex, it could be whatever the issue might be. And let's imagine that you, at one point in your life, was grappling with that issue. This is a very hard question. This is a very, very hard question as a parent. Meaning, on one hand, I don't want to tell my kids, any bad stuff I did. On the other hand, they could benefit so much from knowing that you went through the same struggles and how you came out in a good place, in a right place. And that could actually be a much more helpful bit of information than to simply say, good people don't do that. Sometimes good people do different things. But we have to learn how not to be crushed, how not to be defeated. How Hashem in His mercy enables most mistakes not to be irrevocable, correctable. We can get beyond it. And this is yet another reason. So that we have two concepts in this tainted lineage issue. One is the idea that evil can only enter the world, good can only enter the world in the guise of apparent evil. And the second is that to some degree, true leadership has to be connected on some level with the flaws that people struggle with. And again, as I say, this was brought out so beautifully in Rav Nosson Kamenetsky's Sefer. Imamish was nifter, was it yesterday or right after Shavuos? He's Zichro Baruch. I think he was treated very, very poorly by much of the religious world. His kavanah was L'Shem Shamayim, and it was quite, again, a very, very fascinating, instructive, and meaningful type of book that he produced to understand these nisyonos. So that's kind of what I wanted to share with you about Megillas Rus. And once again, one of the things you see is how Naomi saw how important this marriage was. This marriage was the predicate of redemption. It was not simply a marriage for Rus. That's why the word Goel is used over and over again. The word Goel, redeemer. And although redeemer can be used in a more narrow context, I'm redeeming a field, I'm redeeming a particular person, but I think it's fairly clear that Shmuel Hanavi is using Goel not in the sense of individualistic redeemer, but in the sense of the source of the ultimate Geula that will come to Am Yisrael. So Be'ezras Hashem and the afterglow of Shavuos, I hope that we will take these great lessons to heart. Let me say as well that the Medrash says that one of the very important lessons of Rus is to teach us the reward for those who behave with kindness and compassion. That much of the bracha that came to Rus was because of the kindness and the chesed that she showed for her elderly mother-in-law. And this reminds us, therefore, that Gemilut Chasadim is one of the ways that we bring divine grace into the world and into our lives, and that should certainly be a lesson that we learn from. So wish you well and a good week. Well, that's about it.